Chapter 42 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Alison Valdis. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 42. The Devilfish. For some days the Nautilus kept veering away from the American Ghost. It obviously didn't want to frequent the waves of the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea. Yet there was no shortage of water under its keel, since the average depth of these seas is 1,800 meters. But these waterways, strewn with islands and ploughed by steamers, probably didn't agree with Captain Nemo. On April 16th we raised Martinique and Guadeloupe from a distance about 30 miles. For one instant I could see their lofty peaks. The Canadian was quite disheartened, having counted on putting his plans into execution in the Gulf, either by reaching shore or by pulling alongside one of the many boats plying a coastal trade from one island to another. An escape attempt would have been quite feasible, assuming Ned Land managed to seize the skiff without the captain's knowledge, but in mid-ocean it was unthinkable. The Canadian, Conseil, and I had a pretty long conversation on this subject. For 6 months we had been prisoners aboard the Nautilus. We had fared 17,000 leagues, and as Ned Land put it, there was no end in sight. So he made me a proposition I hadn't anticipated. We were to ask Captain Nemo this question straight out. Did the captain mean to keep us on board his vessel permanently? This measure was distasteful to me. To my mind, it would lead nowhere. We could hope for nothing from the Nautilus's commander, but could depend only on ourselves. Besides, for some time now the man had been gloomier, more withdrawn, less sociable. He seemed to be avoiding me. I encountered him only at rare intervals. He used to take pleasure in explaining the underwater wonders to me. Now he left me to my research, and no longer entered the lounge. What changes had come over him? From what cause? I had no reason to blame myself. Was our presence on board perhaps a burden to him? Even so, I cherished no hopes that the man would set us free. So I begged Ned to let me think about it before taking action. If this measure proved fruitless, it could arouse the captain's suspicions, make our circumstances even more arduous, and jeopardize the Canadian's plans. I might add that I could hardly use our state of health as an argument. Except for that grueling ordeal under the Ice Bank at the South Pole, we had never felt better, neither Ned, Conseil, nor I. The nutritious food, life-giving air, regular routine, and uniform temperature kept illness at bay. And for a man who didn't miss his past existence on land, for a Captain Nemo who was at home here, who went where he wished, who took paths mysterious to others, if not himself in attaining his ends, I could understand such a life. But we ourselves hadn't severed all ties with humanity. For my part, I didn't want my new and unusual research to be buried with my bones. I had now earned the right to pen the definitive book on the sea, and sooner or later I wanted that book to see the light of day. There once more, through the panels opening into these Caribbean waters, 10 meters below the surface of the waves, I found so many fascinating exhibits to describe in my daily notes. Among other zoophytes, there were Portuguese men of war, known by the name Physalia pelagica, like big oblong bladders with a pearly sheen, spreading their membranes to the wind, letting their blue tentacles drift like silken threads. To the eye, delightful jellyfish. To the touch, actual nettles that ooze a corrosive liquid. Among the articulates, there were annelid worms 1½ meters long, furnished with a pink proboscis, equipped with 1,700 organs of locomotion, snaking through the waters, and as they went, throwing off every gleam in the solar spectrum. From the fish branch there were manta rays, enormous cartilaginous fish, 10 feet long and weighing 600 pounds, their pectoral fin triangular, their mid-back slightly arched, their eyes attached to the edges of the face at the front of the head. They floated like wreckage from a ship, sometimes fastening onto our windows like opaque shutters. There were American triggerfish, for which nature has ground only black and white pigments, feather-shaped gobies that were long and plump, with yellow fins and jutting jaws, 16 decimeter mackerel, with short, sharp teeth covered with small scales, and related to the albacore species. Next came swarms of red mullet, corseted in gold strips from head to tail, their shining fins all aquiver, genuine masterpieces of jewelry, formerly sacred to the goddess Diana, much in demand by rich Romans, and about which the old saying goes, "He who catches them doesn't eat them." Finally, adorned with emerald ribbons and dressed in velvet and silk, golden angelfish passed before our eyes, like courtiers in the paintings of Veronese. Spurred gilthead stole by with their swift thoracic fins. Thread herring, 15 inches long, were wrapped in their phosphorescent glimmers. Grey mullet thrashed the sea with their big fleshy tails. Red salmon seemed to mow the waves with their slicing pectorals, and silver moonfish, worthy of their name, rose on the horizon of the waters like the whitish reflections of many moons. How many other marvelous new specimens I still could have observed if, little by little, the Nautilus hadn't settled to the lower strata. Its slanting fins drew it to depths of 2,000 and 3,500 meters. There animal life was represented by nothing more than sea lilies, starfish, delightful crinoids with bell-shaped heads like little chalices on straight stems, top-shell snails, blood-red tooth shells, and fissurella snails, a large species of coastal mollusk. By April 20, we had risen to an average level of 1,500 meters. The nearest land was the island group of the Bahamas, scattered like a batch of cobblestones over the surface of the water. There, high under water, cliffs reared up, straight walls made of craggy chunks arranged like big stone foundations, among which there gaped black caves so deep our electric rays couldn't light them to the far ends. These rocks were hung with huge weeds, immense seed tangle, gigantic fucus, a genuine trellis of water plants fit for a world of giants. In discussing these colossal plants, Conseil, Ned, and I were naturally led into mentioning the sea's gigantic animals. The former were obviously meant to feed the latter. However, through the windows of our almost motionless Nautilus, I could see nothing among these long filaments other than the chief articulates of the division Brachyura, long-legged spider crabs, violet crabs, and sponge crabs, unique to the waters of the Caribbean. It was about 11 o'clock when Ned Land drew my attention to a fearsome commotion out in this huge seaweed. "Well," I said, "these are real devilfish caverns, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those monsters hereabouts." "What?" Conseil put in. "Squid. Ordinary squid. From the class Cephalopoda?" "No," I said, "devilfish of large dimensions. But friend Land is no doubt mistaken, because I don't see a thing." "That's regrettable," Conseil answered. "I'd like to come face to face with one of those devilfish I've heard so much about, which can drag ships down into the depths. Those beasts go by the name of fake is more like it," the Canadian replied sarcastically. "Krakens," Conseil shot back, finishing his word without wincing at his companion's witticism. "Nobody will ever make me believe," Ned Land said, "that such animals exist." "Why not?" Conseil replied. We sincerely believed in master's narwhale. We were wrong, Conseil. No doubt. But there are others with no doubts who believe to this day. Probably, Conseil. But as for me, I'm bound and determined not to accept the existence of any such monster till I've dissected it with my own two hands. Yes, Conseil asked me. Doesn't master believe in gigantic devilfish? Yikes! Who in Hades ever believed in them? The Canadian exclaimed. Many people, Ned, my friend, I said. No fishermen? Scientists, maybe? Pardon me, Ned. Fishermen and scientists. Why, I to whom you speak, Conseil said with the world's straightest face, I recall perfectly seeing a large boat dragged under the waves by the arms of a cephalopod. You saw that? The Canadian asked. Yes, Ned. With your own two eyes? With my own two eyes. Where, may I ask? In St. Malo, Conseil returned unflappably. In the harbor? Ned Land said sarcastically. No, in a church, Conseil replied. In a church? The Canadian exclaimed. Yes, Ned, my friend. It had a picture that portrayed the devilfish in question. Oh, good, Ned Land exclaimed with a burst of laughter. Mr. Conseil put one over on me. Actually, he's right, I said. I've heard about that picture. But the subject it portrays is taken from a legend, and you know how to rate legends in matters of natural history. Besides, when it's an issue of monsters, human imagination always tends to run wild. People not only claim these devilfish could drag ships under, but a certain Olaus Magnus tells of a cephalopod a mile long that looked more like an island than an animal. There's also a story of how the Bishop of Trondheim set up an altar one day on an immense rock. After he finished saying mass, this rock started moving and went back into the sea. The rock was a devilfish. And that's everything we know? The Canadian asked. No, I replied. Another bishop, Pontoppidan of Bergen, also tells of a devilfish so large a whole cavalry regiment could maneuver on it. They sure did go on, those old-time bishops, Ned Land said. Finally, the naturalists of antiquity mentioned some monsters with mouths as big as a gulf, which were too huge to get through the Strait of Gibraltar. Good work, men, the Canadian put in. But in all these stories, is there any truth? Conseil asked. None at all, my friends. At least in those that go beyond the bounds of credibility and fly off into fable or legend. Yet for the imaginings of these storytellers there had to be, if not a cause, at least an excuse. It can't be denied that some species of squid and other devilfish are quite large, though still smaller than cetaceans. Aristotle put the dimensions of one squid at 5 cubits, or 3.1 meters. Our fishermen frequently see specimens over 1.8 meters long. The museums in Trieste and Montpellier have preserved some devilfish carcasses measuring 2 meters. Besides, according to the calculations of naturalists, one of these animals, only 6 feet long, would have tentacles as long as 27, which is enough to make a fearsome monster. Does anybody fish for them nowadays? The Canadian asked. If they don't fish for them, sailors at least sight them. A friend of mine, Captain Paul Boss of Le Havre, has often sworn to me that he encountered one of these monsters of colossal size in the seas of the East Indies. The most astonishing event, which proves that these gigantic animals undeniably exist, took place a few years ago in 1861. What event was that? Ned Land asked. Just this. In 1861, to the northeast of Tenerife, and fairly near the latitude where we are right now, the crew of the gunboat Alecto spotted a monstrous squid swimming in their waters. Commander Bouguer approached the animal and attacked it with blows from harpoons and blasts from rifles, but without much success because bullets and harpoons crossed its soft flesh as if it were semi-liquid jelly. After several fruitless attempts, the crew managed to slip a noose around the mollusk's body. This noose slid as far as the caudal fins and came to a halt. Then they tried to haul the monster on board, but its weight was so considerable that when they tugged at the rope, the animal parted company with its tail, and deprived of this adornment, it disappeared beneath the waters. "Finally, an actual event," Ned Land said. "An indisputable event, my gallant Ned. Accordingly, people have proposed naming this devilfish Bouguer's squid." "And how long was it?" the Canadian asked. "Didn't it measure about 6 meters?" said Conseil, who was stationed at the window and examining anew the crevices in the cliff. "Precisely," I replied. "Wasn't its head," Conseil went on, "crowned by 8 tentacles that quivered in the water like a nest of snakes?" "Precisely." "Weren't its eyes prominently placed and considerably enlarged?" "Yes, Conseil." "And wasn't its mouth a real parrot's beak, but of fearsome size?" "Correct, Conseil." "Well, with all due respect to Master," Conseil replied serenely, "if this isn't Bouguer's squid, it's at least one of his close relatives." I stared at Conseil. Ned Land rushed to the window. "What an awful animal!" he exclaimed. I stared in my turn, and couldn't keep back a movement of revulsion. Before my eyes there quivered a horrible monster, worthy of a place among the most far-fetched teratological legends. It was a squid of colossal dimensions, fully 8 meters long. It was traveling backward with tremendous speed in the same direction as the Nautilus. It gazed with enormous, staring eyes that were tinted sea green. Its 8 arms, or more accurately feet, were rooted in its head, which has earned these animals the name Cephalopod. Its arms stretched a distance twice the length of its body, and were writhing like the serpentine hair of the Furies. You could plainly see its 250 suckers arranged over the inner sides of its tentacles and shaped like semispheric capsules. Sometimes these suckers fastened onto the lounge windows by creating vacuums against it. The monster's mouth, a beak made of horn and shaped like that of a parrot, opened and closed vertically. Its tongue, also of horn substance and armed with several rows of sharp teeth, would flicker out from between these genuine shears. What a freak of nature! A bird's beak on a mollusk. Its body was spindle-shaped and swollen in the middle, a fleshy mass that must have weighed 20,000 to 25,000 kilograms. Its unstable color would change with tremendous speed as the animal grew irritated, passing successively from bluish gray to reddish brown. What was irritating this mollusk? No doubt the presence of the Nautilus, even more fearsome than itself, and which it couldn't grip with its mandibles or the suckers on its arms. And yet what monsters these devilfish are! What vitality our Creator has given them! What vigor in their movements, thanks to their owning a triple heart! Sheer chance had placed us in the presence of this squid, and I didn't want to lose this opportunity to meticulously study such a cephalopod specimen. I overcame the horror that its appearance inspired in me, picked up a pencil, and began to sketch it. "Perhaps this is the same as the Alectos," Conseil said. "Can't be," the Canadian replied, "because this one's complete, while the other one lost its tail." "That doesn't necessarily follow," I said. "The arms and tails of these animals grow back through regeneration, and in 7 years, the tail on Bouguer's squid has certainly had time to sprout again." "Anyhow," Ned shot back, "if it isn't this fellow, maybe it's one of those." Indeed, other devilfish had appeared at the starboard window, I counted 7 of them. They provided the Nautilus with an escort, and I could hear their beaks gnashing on the sheet iron hull. We couldn't have asked for a more devoted following. I continued sketching. These monsters kept pace in our waters with such precision. They seemed to be standing still, and I could have traced their outlines in miniature on the window. But we were moving at a moderate speed. All at once the Nautilus stopped. A jolt made it tremble through its entire framework. "Did we strike bottom?" I asked. "In any event, we're already clear," the Canadian replied, "because we're afloat." The Nautilus was certainly afloat, but it was no longer in motion. The blades of its propeller weren't churning the waves. A minute passed. Followed by his chief officer, Captain Nemo entered the lounge. I hadn't seen him for a good while. He looked gloomy to me. Without speaking to us, without even seeing us perhaps, he went to the panel, stared at the Devilfish, and said a few words to his chief officer. The latter went out. Soon the panels closed. The ceiling lit up. I went over to the captain. "An unusual assortment of devilfish," I told him, as carefree as a collector in front of an aquarium. "Correct, Mr. Naturalist," he answered me. "And we're going to fight them at close quarters." I gaped at the captain. I thought my hearing had gone bad. "At close quarters?" I repeated. "Yes, sir. Our propeller is jammed. I think the horn-covered mandibles of one of these squid are entangled in the blades. That's why we aren't moving." "And what are you going to do?" "Rise to the surface and slaughter the vermin." "A difficult undertaking." "Correct. Our electric bullets are ineffective against such soft flesh, where they don't meet enough resistance to go off. But we'll attack the beasts with axes." "And harpoons, sir," the Canadian said, "if you don't turn down my help." "I accept it, Mr. Land." "We'll go with you," I said. And we followed Captain Nemo, heading to the central companionway. There, some 10 men were standing by for the assault, armed with boarding axes. Conseil and I picked up 2 more axes. Ned Land seized a harpoon. By then the Nautilus had returned to the surface of the waves. Stationed on the top steps, one of the seamen undid the bolts of the hatch. But he had scarcely unscrewed the nuts when the hatch flew up with tremendous violence, obviously pulled open by the suckers on a devilfish's arm. Instantly, one of those long arms glided like a snake into the opening, and 20 others were quivering above. With a sweep of the axe, Captain Nemo chopped off this fearsome tentacle, which slid writhing down the steps. Just as we were crowding each other to reach the platform, 2 more arms lashed the air, swooped on the seaman stationed in front of Captain Nemo, and carried the fellow away with irresistible violence. Captain Nemo gave a shout and leapt outside. We rushed after him. What a scene! Seized by the tentacle and glued to its suckers, the unfortunate man was swinging in the air at the mercy of this enormous appendage. He gasped, he choked, he yelled, "Help! Help!" These words, pronounced in French, left me deeply stunned. So I had a fellow countryman on board, perhaps several. I'll hear his harrowing plea the rest of my life. The poor fellow is done for. Who could tear him from such a powerful grip? Even so, Captain Nemo rushed at the devilfish and with a sweep of the axe, hewed one more of its arms. His chief officer struggled furiously with other monsters crawling up the Nautilus's sides. The crew battled with flailing axes. The Canadian, Conseil, and I sank our weapons into these fleshy masses. An intense, musky odor filled the air. It was horrible. For an instant, I thought the poor man entwined by the devilfish might be torn loose from its powerful suction. 7 arms out of 8 had been chopped off. Brandishing its victim like a feather, one lone tentacle was writhing in the air. But just as Captain Nemo and his chief officer rushed at it, the animal shot off a spout of blackish liquid, secreted by a pouch located in its abdomen. It blinded us. When this cloud had disappeared, the squid was gone, and so was my poor fellow countryman. What rage then drove us against these monsters? We lost all self-control. 10 or 12 devilfish had overrun the Nautilus's platform and sides. We piled helter-skelter into the thick of these sawed-off snakes, which darted over the platform amid waves of blood and sepia ink. It seemed as if these viscous tentacles grew back like the many heads of Hydra. At every thrust, Ned Land's harpoon would plunge into a squid's sea-green eye and burst it. But my daring companion was suddenly toppled by the tentacles of a monster he could not avoid. Oh, my heart nearly exploded with excitement and horror. The squid's fearsome beak was wide open over Ned Land. The poor man was about to be cut in half. I ran to his rescue, but Captain Nemo got there first. His axe disappeared between the two enormous mandibles, and the Canadian, miraculously saved, stood and plunged his harpoon all the way into the devilfish's triple heart. "Tit for tat," Captain Nemo told the Canadian. "I owed it to myself." Ned bowed without answering him. The struggle had lasted a quarter of an hour. Defeated, mutilated, battered to death, the monsters finally yielded to us and disappeared beneath the waves. Red with blood, motionless by the beacon, Captain Nemo stared at the sea that had swallowed one of his companions, and large tears streamed from his eyes. End of chapter 42.
Chapter 19 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sherry Gardner. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 19. The Gulf Stream. This dreadful scene on April 20th, none of us will ever be able to forget. I wrote it up in a state of intense excitement. Later, I reviewed my narrative. I read it to Conseil and the Canadian. They found it accurate in detail, but deficient in impact. To convey such sights, it would take the pen of our most famous poet, Victor Hugo, author of The Toilers of the Sea. As I said, Captain Nemo wept while staring at the waves. His grief was immense. This was the second companion he had lost since we had come aboard. And what a way to die! Smashed, strangled, crushed by the fearsome arms of a devilfish, ground between its iron mandibles, this friend would never rest with his companions in the placid waters of their coral cemetery. As for me, what had harrowed my heart in the thick of this struggle was the despairing yell given by this unfortunate man. Forgetting his regulation language, this poor Frenchman had reverted to speaking his own mother tongue to fling out one supreme plea. Among the Nautilus's crew, allied body and soul with Captain Nemo, and likewise fleeing from human contact, I had found a fellow countryman. Was he the only representative of France in this mysterious alliance, obviously made up of individuals from different nationalities? This was just one more of those insoluble problems that kept welling up in my mind. Captain Nemo re-entered his stateroom, and I saw no more of him for a good while. But how sad, despairing, and irresolute he must have felt, to judge from this ship whose soul he was, which reflected his every mood. The Nautilus no longer kept to a fixed heading. It drifted back and forth, riding with the waves like a corpse. Its propeller had been disentangled but was barely put to use. It was navigating at random. It couldn't tear itself away from the setting of this last struggle, from this sea that had devoured one of its own. 10 days went by in this way. It was only on May 1st that the Nautilus openly resumed its northbound course, after raising the Bahamas at the mouth of Old Bahama Channel. We then went with the current of the sea's greatest river, which has its own banks, fish, and temperature. I mean the Gulf Stream. It is indeed a river that runs independently through the middle of the Atlantic, its waters never mixing with the ocean's waters. It's a salty river, saltier than the sea surrounding it. Its average depth is 3,000 feet, its average width 60 miles. In certain localities, its current moves at a speed of 4 kilometers per hour. The unchanging volume of its waters is greater than that of all the world's rivers combined. As discovered by Commander Maury, the true source of the Gulf Stream, its starting point if you prefer, is located in the Bay of Biscay. There its waters, still weak in temperature and color, begin to form. It goes down south, skirts equatorial Africa, warms its waves in the rays of the torrid zone, crosses the Atlantic, reaches Cape Soraka on the coast of Brazil, and forks into two branches, one going to the Caribbean Sea for further saturation with heat particles. Then entrusted with restoring the balance between hot and cold temperatures, and with mixing tropical and northern waters, the Gulf Stream begins to play its stabilizing role. Attaining a white heat in the Gulf of Mexico, it heads north up the American coast, advances as far as Newfoundland, swerves away under the thrust of a cold current from the Davis Strait, and resumes its ocean course by going along a great circle of the earth on a rum line. It then divides into two arms near the 43rd parallel. One, helped by the northeast trade winds, returns to the Bay of Biscay and the Azores. The other washes the shores of Ireland and Norway with lukewarm water, goes beyond Spitzbergen where its temperature falls to 4 degrees centigrade, and fashions the open sea at the pole. It was on this oceanic river that the Nautilus was then navigating. Leaving old Bahama Channel, which is 14 leagues wide by 350 meters deep, the Gulf Stream moves at the rate of 8 kilometers per hour. Its speed steadily decreases as it advances northward, and we must pray that this steadiness continues, because, as experts agree, if its speed and direction were to change, the climates of Europe would undergo disturbances whose consequences are incalculable. Near noon I was on the platform with Conseil. I shared with him the relevant details on the Gulf Stream. When my explanation was over, I invited him to dip his hands into its current. Conseil did so, and he was quite astonished to experience no sensation of either hot or cold. "That comes," I told him, "from the water temperature of the Gulf Stream, which, as it leaves the Gulf of Mexico, is barely different from your blood temperature. This Gulf Stream is a huge heat generator that enables the coasts of Europe to be decked in eternal greenery. And if Commander Maury is correct, were one to harness the full warmth of this current, it would supply enough heat to keep molten a river of iron solder as big as the Amazon or the Missouri." Just then the Gulf Stream speed was 2.25 meters per second. So distinct is its current from the surrounding sea, its confined waters stand out against the ocean and operate on a different level from the colder waters. Murky as well, and very rich in saline material, their pure indigo contrasts with the green waves surrounding them. Moreover, their line of demarcation is so clear that abreast of the Carolinas, the Nautilus's spur cut the waves of the Gulf Stream while its propeller was still churning those belonging to the ocean. This current swept along with it a whole host of moving creatures. Argonauts, so common in the Mediterranean, voyaged here in schools of large numbers. Among cartilaginous fish, the most remarkable were rays, whose ultra-slender tails made up nearly a third of the body, which was shaped like a huge diamond 25 feet long. Then little 1-meter sharks, the head large, the snout short and rounded, the teeth sharp and arranged in several rows, the body seemingly covered with scales. Among bony fish, I noted grizzled wrasse unique to these seas, deep-water gilthead, whose iris has a fiery gleam, 1-meter croakers whose large mouths bristle with small teeth and which let out thin cries, black rudderfish, like those I've already discussed, blue dorados accented with gold and silver, rainbow-hued parrotfish that can rival the loveliest tropical birds in coloring, banded blennies with triangular heads, bluish flounder without scales, toadfish covered with a crosswise yellow band in the shape of a T, swarms of little freckled gobies stippled with brown spots, lungfish with silver heads and yellow tails, various specimens of salmon, mullet with slim figures and a softly glowing radiance that Cephalopod dedicated to the memory of his wife, and finally the American cavala, a handsome fish decorated by every honorary order, bedizened with their every ribbon, frequenting the shores of this great nation where ribbons and orders are held in such low esteem. I might add that during the night the Gulf Stream's phosphorescent waters rivaled the electric glow of our beacon, especially in the stormy weather that frequently threatened us. On May 8th, while abreast of North Carolina, we were across from Cape Hatteras once more. There the Gulf Stream is 75 miles wide and 210 meters deep. The Nautilus continued to wander at random. Seemingly, all supervision had been jettisoned. Under these conditions, I admit that we could easily have gotten away. In fact, the populous shores offered ready refuge everywhere. The sea was plowed continuously by the many steamers providing service between the Gulf of Mexico and New York or Boston, and it was crossed night and day by little schooners engaged in coastal trade over various points on the American shore. We could hope to be picked up, so it was a promising opportunity despite the 30 miles that separated the Nautilus from these Union coasts. But one distressing circumstance totally thwarted the Canadians' plans. The weather was thoroughly foul. We were approaching waterways where storms are commonplace, the very homeland of tornadoes and cyclones specifically engendered by the Gulf Stream's current. To face a frequently raging sea in a frail skiff was a race to certain disaster. Ned Land conceded this himself. So he champed at the bit in the grip of an intense homesickness that could be cured only by our escape. "Sir," he told me that day, "it's got to stop. I want to get to the bottom of this. Your Nemo's veering away from shore and heading up north. But believe you me, I had my fill at the South Pole, and I'm not going with him to the North Pole." "What can we do, Ned, since it isn't feasible to escape right now?" "I keep coming back to my idea. We've got to talk to the captain. When we were in your own country's seas, you didn't say a word. Now that we're in mine, I intend to speak up. Before a few days are out, I figure the Nautilus will lie abreast of Nova Scotia. And from there to Newfoundland is the mouth of a large gulf, and the St. Lawrence empties into that gulf. And the St. Lawrence is my own river, the river running by Quebec, my hometown. And when I think about all this, my gorge rises and my hair stands on end. Honestly, sir, I'd rather jump overboard. I can't stay here any longer. I'm suffocating." The Canadian was obviously at the end of his patience. His vigorous nature couldn't adapt to this protracted imprisonment. His facial appearance was changing by the day. His moods grew gloomier and gloomier. I had a sense of what he was suffering because I also was gripped by homesickness. Nearly 7 months had gone by without our having any news from shore. Moreover, Captain Nemo's reclusiveness, his changed disposition, and especially his total silence since the battle with the Devilfish, all made me see things in a different light. I no longer felt the enthusiasm of our first days on board. You needed to be Flemish like Conseil to accept these circumstances, living in a habitat designed for cetaceans and other denizens of the deep. Truly, if that gallant lad had owned gills instead of lungs, I think he would have made an outstanding fish. "Well, sir," Ned Land went on, seeing that I hadn't replied, Well, Ned, you want me to ask Captain Nemo what he intends to do with us?" "Yes, sir." "Even though he has already made that clear?" "Yes, I want it settled once and for all. Speak just for me, strictly on my behalf if you want." "But I rarely encounter him. He positively avoids me." "All the more reason you should go look him up." "I'll confer with him, Ned." "When?" the Canadian asked insistently. "When I encounter him. Professor Aronnax, would you like me to go find him myself?" "No, let me do it tomorrow." "Today," Ned Land said. "So be it. I'll see him today," I answered the Canadian, who, if he took action himself, would certainly have ruined everything. I was left to myself. His request granted, I decided to dispose of it immediately. I like things over and done with. I re-entered my stateroom. From there I could hear movements inside Captain Nemo's quarters. I couldn't pass up this chance for an encounter. I knocked on his door. I received no reply. I knocked again, then tried the knob. The door opened. I entered. The captain was there. He was bending over his work table and hadn't heard me. Determined not to leave without questioning him, I drew closer. He looked up sharply with a frowning brow and said in a pretty stern tone, "Oh, it's you. What do you want?" "To speak with you, Captain." "But I'm busy, sir. I'm at work. I give you the freedom to enjoy your privacy. Can't I have the same for myself?" This reception was less than encouraging, but I was determined to give as good as I got. "Sir," I said coolly, "I need to speak with you on a matter that simply can't wait." "Whatever could that be, sir?" he replied sarcastically. "Have you made some discovery that has escaped me? Has the sea yielded up some novel secret to you?" We were miles apart. But before I could reply, he showed me a manuscript open on the table and told me in a more serious tone, "Here, Professor Aronnax, is a manuscript written in several languages. It contains a summary of my research under the sea, and God willing, it won't perish with me. Signed with my name, complete with my life story, this manuscript will be enclosed in a small, unsinkable contrivance. The last surviving man on the Nautilus will throw this contrivance into the sea, and it will go wherever the waves carry it." The man's name, his life story written by himself, so the secret of his existence might someday be unveiled. But just then I saw this announcement only as a lead-in to my topic. "Captain," I replied, "I'm all praise for this idea you're putting into effect. The fruits of your research must not be lost. But the methods you're using strike me as primitive. Who knows where the winds will take that contrivance, into whose hands it may fall? Can't you find something better? Can't you or one of your men—" "Never, sir," the captain said, swiftly interrupting me. "But my companions and I would be willing to safeguard this manuscript. And if you give us back our freedom—" "Your freedom!" Captain Nemo put in, standing up. "Yes, sir, and that's the subject on which I wanted to confer with you. For 7 months we've been aboard your vessel, and I ask you today, in the name of my companions as well as myself, if you intend to keep us here forever." "Professor Aronnax," Captain Nemo said, "I'll answer you today just as I did 7 months ago. Whomever boards the Nautilus must never leave it. What you're inflicting on us is outright slavery. Call it anything you like." "But every slave has the right to recover his freedom by any worthwhile available means." "Who has denied you that right?" Captain Nemo replied. "Did I ever try to bind you with your word of honor?" The captain stared at me, crossing his arms. "Sir," I told him, "to take up this subject a second time would be distasteful to both of us. So let's finish what we've started. I repeat, it isn't just for myself that I raise this issue. To me, research is a relief, a potent diversion, an enticement, a passion that can make me forget everything else. Like you, I'm a man neglected and unknown. living in the faint hope that someday I can pass on to future generations the fruits of my labors, figuratively speaking, by means of some contrivance left to the luck of winds and waves. In short, I can admire you and comfortably go with you while playing a role I only partly understand, but I still catch glimpses of other aspects of your life that are surrounded by involvements and secrets that, alone on board, my companions and I can't share. And even when our hearts could beat with yours, moved by some of your griefs or stirred by your deeds of courage and genius, we've had to stifle even the slightest token of that sympathy that arises at the sight of something fine and good, whether it comes from friend or enemy. All right, then. It's this feeling of being alien to your deepest concerns that makes our situation unacceptable, impossible, even impossible for me, but especially for Ned Land. Every man, by virtue of his very humanity, deserves fair treatment. Have you considered how a love of freedom and hatred of slavery could lead to plans of vengeance in a temperament like the Canadian's? What he might think, attempt, endeavor? I fell silent. Captain Nemo stood up. Ned Land can think, attempt, or endeavor anything he wants. What difference is it to me? I didn't go looking for him. I don't keep him on board for my pleasure. As for you, Professor Aronnax, you're a man able to understand anything, even silence. I have nothing more to say to you. Let this first time you've come to discuss this subject also be the last, because a second time I won't even listen." I withdrew. From that day forward, our position was very strained. I reported this conversation to my two companions. "Now we know," Ned said, "that we can't expect a thing from this man. The Nautilus is nearing Long Island. We'll escape no matter what the weather." But the skies became more and more threatening. There were conspicuous signs of a hurricane on the way. The atmosphere was turning white and milky. Slender sheaves of cirrus clouds were followed on the horizon by layers of nimbocumulus. Other low clouds fled swiftly. The sea grew towering, inflated by long swells. Every bird had disappeared except a few petrels, friends of the storms. The barometer fell significantly, indicating a tremendous tension in the surrounding haze. The mixture in our storm glass decomposed under the influence of the electricity charging the air. A struggle of the elements was approaching. The storm burst during the daytime of May 13th, just as the Nautilus was cruising abreast of Long Island, a few miles from the Narrows to Upper New York Bay. I'm able to describe this struggle of the elements because Captain Nemo didn't flee into the ocean depths. Instead, from some inexplicable whim, he decided to brave it out on the surface. The wind was blowing from the southwest, initially a stiff breeze, in other words, with a speed of 15 meters per second, which built to 25 meters near 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is the figure for major storms. Unshaken by these squalls, Captain Nemo stationed himself on the platform. He was lashed around the waist to withstand the monstrous breakers foaming over the deck. I hoisted and attached myself to the same place, dividing my wonderment between the storm and this incomparable man who faced it head on. The raging sea was swept with huge tattered clouds drenched by the waves. I saw no more of the small intervening billows that form in the troughs of the big crests. Just long, soot-colored undulations with crests so compact they didn't foam. They kept growing taller. They were spurring each other on. The Nautilus sometimes lying on its side, sometimes standing on end like a mast, rolled and pitched frightfully. Near 5 o'clock, a torrential rain fell, but it lulled neither wind nor sea. The hurricane was unleashed at a speed of 45 meters per second. Hence almost 40 leagues per hour. Under these conditions, houses topple, Roof tiles puncture doors, iron railings snap in two, and 24-pounder cannons relocate. And yet, in the midst of this turmoil, the Nautilus lived up to that saying of an expert engineer, "A well-constructed hull can defy any sea." This submersible was no resisting rock that waves could demolish. It was a steel spindle, obediently in motion, without rigging or masting, and able to brave their fury with impunity. Meanwhile, I was carefully examining these unleashed breakers. They measured up to 15 meters in height over a length of 150 to 175 meters, and the speed of their propagation, half that of the wind, was 15 meters per second. Their volume and power increased with the depth of the waters. I then understood the role played by these waves, which trap air in their flanks and release it in the depths of the sea where its oxygen brings life. Their utmost pressure, it has been calculated, can build to 3,000 kilograms on every square foot of surface they strike. It was such waves in the Hebrides that repositioned a stone block weighing 84,000 pounds. It was their relatives in the tidal wave on December 23, 1854, that toppled part of the Japanese city of Tokyo, then went that same day at 700 kilometers per hour to break on the beaches of America. After nightfall, the storm grew in intensity. As in the 1860 cyclone on Reunion Island, the barometer fell to 710 millimeters. At the close of day, I saw a big ship passing on the horizon, struggling painfully. It lay to at half steam in an effort to hold steady on the waves. It must have been a steamer on one of those lines out of New York to Liverpool or Le Havre. It soon vanished into the shadows. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the skies caught on fire. The air was streaked with violent flashes of lightning. I couldn't stand this brightness, but Captain Nemo stared straight at it, as if to inhale the spirit of the storm. A dreadful noise filled the air, a complicated noise made up of the roar of crashing breakers, the howl of the wind, claps of thunder. The wind shifted to every point of the horizon, and the cyclone left the east to return there after passing through north, west, and south, moving in the opposite direction of revolving storms in the southern hemisphere. Oh, that Gulf Stream! It truly lives up to its nickname, the Lord of Storms. All by itself, it creates these fearsome cyclones through the difference in temperature between its currents and the superimposed layers of air. The rain was followed by a downpour of fire. Droplets of water changed into exploding tufts. You would have thought Captain Nemo was courting a death worthy of himself, seeking to be struck by lightning. In one hideous pitching movement, the Nautilus reared its steel spur into the air like a lightning rod, and I saw long sparks shoot down it. Shattered, at the end of my strength, I slid flat on my belly to the hatch. I opened it and went below to the lounge. By then the storm had reached its maximum intensity. It was impossible to stand upright inside the Nautilus. Captain Nemo re-entered near midnight. I could hear the ballast tanks filling little by little, and the Nautilus sank gently beneath the surface of the waves. Through the lounge's open windows, I saw large frightened fish passing like phantoms in the fiery waters. Some were struck by lightning right before my eyes. The Nautilus kept descending. I thought it would find calm again at 15 meters down. No, the upper strata were too violently agitated. It needed to sink to 50 meters, searching for a resting place in the bowels of the sea. But once there, what tranquility we found! What silence! What peace all around us! Who would have known that a dreadful hurricane was then unleashed on the surface of this ocean? End of chapter 19. Recording by Sherry Gardner.
44 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 44. In latitude 47 degrees 24 minutes and longitude 17 degrees 28 minutes. In the aftermath of this storm we were thrown back to the east. Away went any hope of escaping to the landing places of New York or the St. Lawrence. In despair, poor Ned went into seclusion like Captain Nemo. Conseil and I no longer left each other. As I said, the Nautilus veered to the east. To be more accurate, I should have said to the northeast. Sometimes on the surface of the waves, sometimes beneath them, the ship wandered for days amid these mists, so feared by navigators. These are caused chiefly by melting ice, which keeps the air extremely damp. How many ships have perished in these waterways as they tried to get directions from the hazy lights on the coast? How many casualties have been caused by these opaque mists? How many collisions have occurred with these reefs, where the breaking surf is covered by the noise of the wind? How many vessels have rammed each other, despite their running lights, despite the warnings given by their boatswain's pipes and alarm bells? So, the floor of this sea had the appearance of a battlefield where every ship, defeated by the ocean, still lay, some already old and encrusted, others newer and reflecting our beacon light on the ironwork and copper undersides. Among these vessels, how many went down with all hands, with their crews and hosts of immigrants, at these trouble spots so prominent in the statistics: Cape Race, St. Paul Island, the Strait of Belle Isle, the St. Lawrence estuary? And in only a few years, how many victims have been furnished to the obituary notices by the Royal Mail, Inman, and Montreal lines, by vessels named the Solway, the Isis, the Parramatta, the Hungarian, the Canadian, the Anglo-Saxon, the Humboldt, and the United States, all run aground; by the Arctic and the Lyonnais, sunk in collisions; by the President, the Pacific, and the city of Glasgow, lost for reasons unknown in the midst of their gloomy rubble, the Nautilus navigated as if passing the dead in review. By May 15th, we were off the southern tip of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. These banks are the result of marine sedimentation, an extensive accumulation of organic waste brought either from the equator by the Gulf Stream's current, or from the North Pole by the counter-current of cold water that skirts the American coast. Here, too, erratically drifting chunks collect from the ice break-up. Here a huge boneyard forms from fish, mollusks, and zoophytes, dying over it by the billions. The sea is of no great depth at the Grand Banks, a few hundred fathoms at best. But to the south there is a deep, suddenly occurring depression, a 3,000-meter pit. Here the Gulf Stream widens. Its waters come to full bloom. It loses its speed and temperature, but it turns into a sea. Among the fish that the Nautilus startled on its way, I'll mention a 1-meter lumpfish, blackish on top, with orange on the belly, and rare among its brethren in that it practices monogamy, a good-sized eel-pout, a type of emerald moray whose flavor is excellent, wolf-fish with big eyes and a head somewhat resembling a canine's, viviparous blennies whose eggs hatch inside their bodies like those of snakes, bloated gobio, or black gudgeon, measuring 2 decimeters, grenadiers with long tails and gleaming with a silvery glow, speedy fish venturing far from their high Arctic seas. Our nets also hauled in a bold, daring, vigorous, and muscular fish, armed with prickles on its head and stings on its fins, a real scorpion measuring 2 to 3 meters, the ruthless enemy of cod, blennies, and salmon. It was the bullhead of the northerly seas, a fish with red fins and a brown body covered with nodules. The Nautilus's fishermen had some trouble getting a grip on this animal, which, thanks to the formation of its gill covers, can protect its respiratory organs from any parching contact with the air, and can live out of water for a good while. And I'll mention, for the record, some little banded blennies that follow ships into the northernmost seas, sharp-snouted carp exclusive to the North Atlantic, scorpion fish, and lastly the gadoid family, chiefly the cod species, which I detected in their waters of choice over these inexhaustible Grand Banks. Because Newfoundland is simply an underwater peak, you could call these cod mountain fish. While the Nautilus was clearing a path through their tight ranks, Conseil couldn't refrain from making this comment. "Merci! Look at these cod," he said. "Why, I thought cod were flat, like dab or sole." "Innocent boy!" I exclaimed. "Cod are flat only at the grocery store when they're cut open and spread out on display. But in the water they're like mullet, spindle-shaped and perfectly built for speed." "I can easily believe, master," Conseil replied. "But what crowds of them! What swarms!" "Bah, my friend, there'd be many more without their enemies, scorpion fish and human beings. Do you know how many eggs have been counted in a single female?" "I'll go all out," Conseil replied. 500,000. 11,000,000, my friend. 11,000,000? I refuse to accept that until I count them myself." "So count them, Conseil. But it would be less work to believe me. Besides, Frenchmen, Englishmen, Americans, Danes, and Norwegians catch these cods by the thousands. They're eaten in prodigious quantities, and without the astonishing fertility of these fish, the seas would soon be depopulated of them. Accordingly, in England and America alone, 5,000 ships, manned by 75,000 seamen, go after cod. Each ship brings back an average catch of 4,400 fish, making 22 million. Off the coast of Norway, the total is the same." "Fine," Conseil replied. "I'll take master's word for it. I won't count them." "Count what?" "Those 11,000,000 eggs. But I'll make one comment." "What's that?" "If all their eggs hatched, just 4 codfish could feed England, America, and Norway." As we skimmed the depths of the Great Banks, I could see perfectly those long fishing lines, each armed with 200 hooks, that every boat dangled by the dozens. The lower end of each line dragged the bottom by means of a small grappling iron, and at the surface it was secured to the buoy rope of a cork float. The Nautilus had to maneuver shrewdly in the midst of this underwater spiderweb. But the ship didn't stay long in these heavily traveled waterways. It went up to about latitude 42 degrees. This brought it abreast of St. John's in Newfoundland and Heart's Content, where the Atlantic cable reaches its end point. Instead of continuing north, the Nautilus took an easterly heading, as if to go along this plateau on which the telegraph cable rests, where multiple soundings have given the contours of the terrain with the utmost accuracy. It was on May 17th, about 500 miles from Heart's Content and 2,800 meters down, that I spotted this cable lying on the sea floor. Conseil, whom I hadn't alerted, mistook it at first for a gigantic sea snake, and was gearing up to classify it in his best manner. But I enlightened the fine lad, and let him down gently by giving him various details on the laying of this cable. The first cable was put down during the years 1857 to 1858. But after transmitting about 400 telegrams, it went dead. In 1863, engineers built a new cable that measured 3,400 kilometers, weighing 4,500 metric tons, and was shipped aboard the Great Eastern. This attempt also failed. Now then, on May 25th, while submerged to a depth of 3,836 meters, the Nautilus lay in precisely the locality where this second cable suffered the rupture that ruined the undertaking. It happened 638 miles from the coast of Ireland. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, all contact with Europe broke off. The electricians on board decided to cut the cable before fishing it up, and by 11 o'clock that evening they had retrieved the damaged part. They repaired the joint and its splice. Then the cable was resubmerged. But a few days later it snapped again and couldn't be recovered from the ocean depths. These Americans refused to give up. The daring Cyrus Field, who had risked his whole fortune to promote this undertaking, called for a new bond issue. It sold out immediately. Another cable was put down under better conditions. Its sheaves of conducting wire were insulated with a gutta percha covering, which was protected by a padding of textile material enclosed in a metal sheath. The Great Eastern put back to sea on July 13th, 1866. The operation proceeded apace, yet there was one hitch. As they gradually unrolled this third cable, the electricians observed on several occasions that someone had recently driven nails into it, trying to damage its core. Captain Anderson, his officers, and the engineers put their heads together, then posted a warning that if the culprit were detected, he would be thrown overboard without a trial. After that, these villainous attempts were not repeated. By June 23rd, the Great Eastern was lying no farther than 800 kilometers from Newfoundland, when it received telegraph news from Ireland of an armistice signed between Prussia and Austria after the battle of Sadowa. Through the mists on the 27th, it sighted the port of Heart's Content. The undertaking had ended happily, and in its first dispatch, young America addressed old Europe with these wise words so rarely understood: "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to men of good will." I didn't expect to find this electric cable in mint condition, as it looked on leaving its place of manufacture. The long snake was covered with seashell rubble and bristling with foraminifera. A crust of caked gravel protected it from any mollusks that might bore into it. It rested serenely, sheltered from the sea's motions, until a pressure favourable to the transmission of that electric spark that goes from America to Europe in 32/100ths of a second. This cable will no doubt last indefinitely because, as observers note, its gutta percha casing is improved by a stay in salt water. Besides, on this well-chosen plateau, the cable never lies at depths that could cause a break. The Nautilus followed it to its lowest reaches, located 4,431 meters down, and even there it rested without any stress or strain. Then we returned to the locality where the 1863 accident had taken place. There the ocean floor formed a valley 120 kilometers wide, into which you could fit Mount Blanc, without its summit poking above the surface of the waves. This valley is closed off to the east by a sheer wall 2,000 meters high. We arrived there on May 28th, and the Nautilus lay no farther than 150 kilometers from Ireland. Would Captain Nemo head north and beach us on the British Isles? No. Much to my surprise, he went back down south and returned to European seas. As we swung around the Emerald Isle, I spotted it clear for an instant, plus the lighthouse in Fastnet Rock that guides all those thousands of ships setting out from Glasgow or Liverpool. An important question then popped into my head. Would the Nautilus dare to tackle the English Channel? Ned Land, who promptly reappeared after we hugged shore, never stopped questioning me. What could I answer him? Captain Nemo remained invisible. After giving the Canadian a glimpse of American shores, was he about to show me the coast of France? But the Nautilus kept gravitating southward. On May 30th, in sight of Land's End, it passed between the lowermost tip of England and the Scilly Islands, which it left behind to starboard. If it was going to enter the English Channel, it clearly needed to head east. It did not. All day long, on May 31st, the Nautilus swept around the sea in a series of circles that had me deeply puzzled. It seemed to be searching for a locality that it had some trouble finding. At noon, Captain Nemo himself came to take our bearings. He didn't address a word to me. He looked gloomier than ever. What was filling him with such sadness? Was it our proximity to these European shores? Was he reliving his memories of that country he had left behind? If so, what did he feel? Remorse or regret? For a good while these thoughts occupied my mind, and I had a hunch that fate would soon give away the captain's secrets. The next day, June 1st, the Nautilus kept to the same tack. It was obviously trying to locate some precise spot in the ocean. Just as on the day before, Captain Nemo came to take the altitude of the sun. The sea was smooth and the skies clear. 8 miles to the east, a big steamship was visible on the horizon line. No flag was flapping from the gaff of its fore and aft sail, and I couldn't tell its nationality. A few minutes before the sun passed its zenith, Captain Nemo raised his sextant and took his sights with the utmost precision. The absolute calm of the waves facilitated this operation. The Nautilus lay motionless, neither rolling nor pitching. I was on the platform just then. After determining our position, the captain pronounced only these words: "It's right here." He went down the hatch. Had he seen the vessel change course and seemingly head toward us? I am unable to say. I returned to the lounge. The hatch closed and I heard water hissing in the ballast tanks. The Nautilus began to sink on a vertical line because its propeller was in check and no longer furnished any forward motion. Some minutes later, it stopped at a depth of 833 meters and came to rest on the sea floor. The ceiling lights in the lounge then went out, the panels opened, and through the windows I saw, for a half-mile radius, the sea brightly lit by the beacon's rays. I looked to port and saw nothing but the immenseness of these tranquil waters. To starboard, a prominent bulge on the sea bottom caught my attention. You would have thought it was some ruin enshrouded in a crust of whitened seashells, as if under a mantle of snow. Carefully examining this mass, I could identify the swollen outlines of a ship shorn of its masts, which must have sunk bow first. This casualty certainly dated from some far-off time. To be so caked with the limestone of these waters, this wreckage must have spent many a year on the ocean floor. What ship was this? Why had the Nautilus come to visit its grave? Was it something other than a maritime accident that had dragged this craft under the waters? I wasn't sure what to think. But next to me I heard Captain Nemo's voice slowly say: "Originally the ship was christened the Marseille. It carried 74 cannons and was launched in 1762. On August 13, 1778, commanded by La Poype Vertriot, it fought valiantly against the Preston. On July 4, 1779, as a member of the squadron under Admiral d'Estaing, it assisted in the capture of the island of Grenada. On September 5, 1781, under the Count de Grasse, it took part in the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. In 1794, the new Republic of France changed the name of the ship. On April 16th of that same year, it joined the squadron at Brest under Rear Admiral Villaret de Joyeuse, who was entrusted with escorting a convoy of wheat coming from America under the command of Admiral Van Stabel. In this second year of the French Revolutionary calendar, on the 11th and 12th days of the month of Pasteur, this squadron fought an encounter with the English vessels. Sir, today is June 1st, 1868, or the 13th day in the month of Pasteur. 74 years ago to this day, at this very spot, in latitude 47 degrees 24
minutes
and longitude 17 degrees 28
minutes,
this ship sank after her heroic battle, its 3 masts gone, water in its hold, a third of its crew out of action. It preferred to go to the bottom with its 356 seamen rather than surrender, and with its flag nailed up on the after deck, it disappeared between the waves to shouts of "Long live the Republic!" "This is the Avenger!" I exclaimed. "Yes, sir, the Avenger. A splendid name," Captain Nemo murmured, crossing his arms. End of chapter 44.